Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here for this one.
So we are setting the scene today. It is the late Bronze Age. We're in the 18th dynasty of Egypt.
Right.
And it's somewhere around the year 1446 BC. It's midnight. The air is thick with the heat of the Nile Delta. And human history is literally about to be split completely in two.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate dividing line, you know.
Exactly. Because what we are looking at today is a night of terrifying, inescapable judgment, but simultaneously, and this is the crux of it, a night of astonishing blood-bought mercy.
The entire biblical narrative leading up to this point is basically a prelude, and almost everything written afterward looks back over its shoulder at this specific midnight.
Right. And in today's deep dive, we are unpacking two highly theological, really rigorous pieces of source material.
Yeah.
And they zero in on a mere 6 verses.
Just 6 verses, Exodus chapter 12, verses 23 through 28.
Yep. So our mission today, for you listening, is to look at the mechanics of divine judgment. We want to understand the concept of a substitutionary shield of blood and how this ancient midnight permanently shaped the way we understand memory, the family unit, and worship.
We're going to dig into the original Hebrew, look at the historical context, and really see why this text still confronts us today.
You know, before we can even understand the blood on the doorpost, we have to look at the geopolitical and really the spiritual war that was raging in Egypt at the time.
Right, because the Israelites had been in Egypt for over 4 centuries at this point.
400 years. I mean, they started as favored guests under Joseph, who basically saved the Egyptian empire from mass starvation.
Yeah, but over those 4 centuries, that residency slowly, painfully devolved into state-sanctioned, brutal bondage. They are building the empire with mortar and brick.
Which, you know, presents a massive theological problem if you don't understand the covenantal framework.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the historical data, a people group enslaved for 400 years, it looks like their God lost.
Yeah, it looks like Yahweh just, you know, fell asleep at the wheel while the Egyptian pantheon totally dominated the region.
Exactly. But the material we are analyzing today stresses that this 400-year descent into slavery wasn't a mistake. It was the precise historical fulfillment of a specific covenant.
Right, you're talking about the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis 15.
Yes, exactly. In Genesis 15, God makes an unconditional promise to Abraham. And he explicitly foretells this exact period of darkness.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yahweh says, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years.
But then he promises the rescue. Right.
Right. He says, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions."
So the affliction wasn't some cosmic accident.
Not at all. God was actively orchestrating history. He was allowing the iniquity of the surrounding nations to reach its full measure, while simultaneously, forging a massive nation out of a single family in the incubator of Egypt.
So when we read Exodus 12, we aren't just seeing a spontaneous rescue. We are witnessing an act of terrifying covenantal faithfulness. God is remembering his holy oath.
He is, and that brings us to the plagues themselves, because the conflict between Yahweh and Pharaoh is, it's so much more than a labor dispute over free brick-making.
Right. The 10 plagues are not random natural disasters. It's not just, a weird weather anomaly where the river happened to have a toxic algae bloom.
No, the text frames this as targeted polemical warfare.
A divine takedown, basically.
Yes. The Egyptian worldview was dominated by this concept called Ma'at. It was their idea of cosmic order, balance, and harmony.
And that order was maintained by their massive pantheon of gods.
Exactly. And Pharaoh himself wasn't just a political ruler. He was viewed as the earthly incarnation of Horus and the divine son of the sun god Ra.
So his primary job, as Pharaoh, was to uphold this Ma'at.
Right. So when Yahweh unleashes the plagues, he systematically dismantles the Egyptian religious and economic grid.
He turns the Nile, which was the literal lifeblood of Egypt, associated with the god Hapi, into death.
And then he strikes the sun, Ra, with 3 days of thick, palpable darkness. It's a public, undeniable demonstration that the gods of Egypt are entirely impotent before the creator of the cosmos.
This wasn't just a prison break. It was the total dismantling of a superpower's religious and economic infrastructure. But, dismantling the sun god wasn't enough to break their covenantal amnesia.
No, Yahweh had to strike at the very mechanism of Egyptian future-proofing. Which brings us to the climax, the 10th plague, the slaying of the firstborn.
And we have to ask, why the firstborn? Why is that the ultimate devastation for this specific ancient culture?
Well, in ancient Egyptian society, the firstborn son held a profound, multi-layered status. Economically and politically, he was the heir to the throne.
The legal head of the household in waiting.
Yes. But even more importantly, spiritually, he was the primary priest of the family's ancestor cult.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah. When the father died, it was the firstborn son's strict duty to maintain the feudatory rights. He had to provide the offerings that ensured the father's survival in the afterlife.
So to strike the firstborn isn't just taking away a child. It's literally taking away the nation's future, their economic stability, and their eternal security all at the same time.
It is the total leveling of their civilization. It destroys their past, present, and future in a single midnight stroke.
That is just terrifying to think about.
It is, and what our sources find striking here is the contrast between how Israel is instructed to respond to this threat versus how the ancient pagans typically handled existential terror.
Because the pagans had a whole system for this, right?
Right. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, people utilize what historians call apotropaic magic.
Apotropaic magic.
Yeah. They used magical rituals, incantation bowls, and specifically colored paints to ward off malicious impersonal demons.
So if there was a plague demon coming, you performed a ritual to confuse it or repel it. Like, putting garlic on the door to keep a vampire away. You're trying to trick a mindless force of chaos.
Exactly. You're just trying to deflect it. But Israel's threat that night was not a chaotic demon or some impersonal force of nature.
The threat walking through the land of Goshen was the righteous, holy judgment of Yahweh himself.
Yes. The holy God of Israel was acting as judge. So the blood they were commanded to use was not magic. It was a judicial sign.
Directed toward God.
Exactly. It was directed at God, satisfying his divine demand for justice through a slain substitute.
Which fundamentally shifts the entire paradigm of survival. To survive the judgment of a holy God, they couldn't just lock their doors and hope for the best.
No, they were given an architectural blueprint for a very specific kind of shelter.
Right. Moses instructs the elders of Israel to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into a basin filled with the blood of an unblemished male lamb, and apply that blood to the lintel, which is the mashquaf in Hebrew, and to the two doorposts, the mezuzah.
And we really need to pause here. Because we all know the Sunday school version of this story, right? Israel good, Egypt bad.
Yeah, exactly.
But as people who understand a robust theology of human depravity, we know intellectually that Israel deserved God's wrath too.
Absolutely. And seeing it architecturally rendered here with the blood on the doors is jarring. The material we are looking at really stresses that the judgment was universal in its scope.
That is a vital point the authors underline. No household possessed intrinsic immunity based on moral merit or ethnic heritage.
An Israelite was not safe simply because he could trace his genealogy back to Abraham.
Not at all. God's absolute holiness demands justice against all rebellion and idolatry.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, Israel was deeply steeped in the idolatry of Egypt at this point.
The wrath was coming for every single household. An Israelite without blood on their doorpost would have suffered the exact same devastating judgment as an Egyptian.
Yes. The singular distinguishing factor between life and death was not morality, it was the blood.
I want to spend some serious time on the specific Hebrew verbs used in Exodus 12.23, because the exegesis in our material completely changes the mental image of the Passover for me.
It's fascinating. We have two contrasting actions by Yahweh here. We, bar, and pasach.
Okay, break those down for us.
Verse 23 opens with the verb weababar. This denotes movement across a space specifically, a divine visitation for the purpose of judicial inspection.
Yahweh passes through to actively strike or linagoph the Egyptians.
Right. This is the terrifying execution of holy justice. God is moving through the land as an active, lethal judge, executing a totally righteous sentence.
But then we hit the second verb, pasach. And, in most English translations, this is simply rendered as Passover.
Yeah, which gives a very specific mental image.
Right. The mental image I've always had is that God is walking down the street, he sees the blood, and he essentially bypasses the house. He just skips it and goes to the next one.
That is the common assumption. But the linguistic evidence our sources present suggests a much richer reality. The verb pasach carries the sense of springing forward to protect.
Wait, really?
Yes, it means standing guard over or hovering shieldingly over a door. It is an active posture of defense.
Wait, so let me unpack this to make sure I am grasping the mechanics of this. God is the one sending the judgment, but he is also the one standing in the doorway acting as the shield against his own judgment.
That is the profound paradox of the text. Yahweh does not simply ignore the blood-stained house. He places his own holy presence between the inhabitants of the house and the instrument of destruction.
He becomes the divine shield for his people.
Exactly. The text mentions the destroyer in Hebrew, Hamasheth. Scholars debate whether this is a specific angelic agent of death, like we see later in the Assyrian camp, or a personification of God's lawful wrath.
But the syntax makes it absolutely clear that this destroyer is entirely subject to Yahweh's sovereign control.
Yes, the text says God will not permit or will not allow the destroyer to enter.
Let me try out an analogy here to see if this tracks for you. Think of a highly trained police canine unit.
Okay.
The handler is the one who actively releases the destructive force, the dog, to apprehend a suspect. But if an innocent bystander gets caught in the path, that same handler is the one who will physically throw his own body over the bystander.
Right.
He shields them from the very dog he just released. So God is unleashing the holy terror of his justice on Egypt. But at the blood-stained door, he is physically interposing himself to take the brunt of that destructive force away from the people inside.
That captures the dual action perfectly. Yahweh is both the just judge demanding the penalty and the merciful savior providing the shield.
Wow.
And because he is the shield, the salvation provided is entirely objective. The authors of our material extrapolate on this concept deeply. The blood in the basin was a judicial sign that satisfied the righteous requirement of God's justice.
Because the innocent lamb died, the guilty firstborn inside lived. So imagine two houses on that night. In the first house, you have an Israelite who has applied the blood to the doorpost exactly as commanded. But inside, he is an absolute wreck.
Right, he's terrified.
He is trembling, doubting, wondering if he used enough hyssop, wondering if his faith is strong enough to survive the night.
Yeah.
And in the second house, you have an Egyptian with no blood on his door, but he is feeling perfectly confident. He thinks the plagues are over, he trusts his local gods, and he's sleeping like a baby, who is actually safe.
The terrified Israelite is perfectly safe, and the confident Egyptian is doomed.
Because the terrified Israelite's feelings do not dictate reality. The blood dictates reality.
Precisely. Salvation did not rest on the internal emotional state, the psychological confidence, or the moral track record of the household.
It rested entirely on the objective reality of the substitutionary blood applied as God commanded.
Right. The justice of God is looking for the death of the substitute, not the emotional stability of the sinner.
That is so freeing. So, as the sun rises, the wailing in Egypt begins. Pharaoh finally breaks. The Israelites march out of Goshen. They are suddenly a free people.
Yes.
But moving from the adrenaline of a midnight crisis to the mundane reality of living out, a Tuesday as a free nation, that presents a brand new danger.
It does, the danger of spiritual amnesia.
Yeah.
In verses 24 and 25, the text immediately shifts its focus away from the night of terror and looks to the distant future. Moses commands Israel to observe this event as a perpetual statute forever.
The Hebrew word there is chuk, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
chalk. It comes from a root word meaning to engrave or to inscribe in solid stone.
So this is not a temporary tradition to be observed for a few years and then just gracefully phased out.
Not at all. And God specifically anchors this to the future land. He says, when you enter the land which Yahweh will give you.
Which is so interesting. Why focus on a land they haven't even stepped foot toward yet? They're barely out of the driveway in Goshen.
Because God fundamentally understands the human heart and the spiritual danger of prosperity.
Oh, that's a good point.
It is a universal human trait to cry out to God desperately when we are slaves in Egypt, when we are broke, or facing a horrific medical diagnosis, or watching our marriage collapse.
Right. In the crisis, God has our undivided attention.
But when life gets settled, when we possess the land, when the crops are growing, the bank account is full, and our physical safety is secure, we suffer from a profound amnesia.
We forget the God who orchestrated the rescue in the first place. You listening right now, how often do you cry out for a rescue, only to completely forget the rescuer once the storm passes?
It's human nature, and God knows that simply building a stone monument or giving the nation a day off work for a national holiday isn't going to cure that amnesia.
Because national holidays easily become just hollow excuses for a barbecue.
Exactly. The deliverance had to be actively, physically remembered and reenacted through a very specific mechanism, which the text calls aboda.
Right. And aboda is a brilliant word study. It translates to service or worship.
Yes, and there is a deep theological irony running through the entire Exodus narrative here regarding that word.
Because Israel spent 400 years crying out under the brutal tyrannical aboda. The forced labor of Pharaoh.
Exactly. But God does not free them so they can wander the desert living entirely autonomous, self-directed lives.
The goal of the Exodus was not mere liberation from restraint.
No, they are freed from the service of a tyrant in order to enter into the joyful, holy, prescribed service of Yahweh.
True freedom, in the biblical framework, is not autonomy. It is belonging to a good and righteous master.
And to maintain that abada, God doesn't entrust the preservation of this memory to the government.
He doesn't even place the primary responsibility on the Levitical priesthood in the temple.
No, he places the burden of memory directly inside the home at the family dining table.
Exodus 12.26 and 27 anticipate an inevitable, specific question from the children of the next generation.
Right. A child is going to look at this bizarre annual meal, the bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, the roasted lamb, and they're going to ask, what does this service mean to you?
And God basically scripts the answer for the parents right there.
He does. And notice the weight of the scripted answer. The mandated parental confession is highly theological and deeply rooted in historical fact.
The parent is commanded to say, "It is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over our houses in Egypt and delivered our homes."
The Hebrew word used for sacrifice is zibach, which denotes a bloody victim whose life was forfeited violently.
And the word for delivered is hitzel, which means to aggressively snatch away from imminent danger.
Right, so this isn't a vague moral lesson about being kind to strangers. It is a robust, bloody, historically grounded theological curriculum delivered by a father to a son.
Now, the authors of the material we are reviewing draw some incredibly sharp, polemical applications from this text regarding modern culture, and we really need to impartially look at exactly what they are arguing here.
Yeah.
According to the source, there is a crisis in the modern church because parents routinely outsource the spiritual formation of their children to secular authorities, schools, or even youth ministries.
The authors argue that modern Christian families must actively reject what they categorize as godless ideologies.
Right. They specifically name things like critical race theory, radical secular humanism, and modern gender theory.
Yes. The source views these as forces that seek to undermine biblical authority and dismantle the family structure.
So their argument is that parents must make the home a fortress of sound doctrine, utilizing historic Reformed catechisms to ground their children in redemptive history.
Exactly. They argue this directly mirrors how the ancient Israelites used the Passover meal to catechize their children.
It's fascinating to see how the authors take this ancient command about the Passover meal and turn it into a direct critique of 21st century secular education.
They're essentially arguing that to hand your child over to secular ideologies is to repeat the mistake of returning to Egypt.
And while we are just laying out their argument here impartially, it does force you to look at the sheer weight of what God is demanding of these parents in the text.
It's a massive responsibility.
I mean, we live in an era where we outsource literally everything. We outsource our lawn care, we outsource our taxes to software, we outsource our meals to delivery apps.
They do.
The underlying challenge of this text is asking a parent to refuse to outsource the fundamental why of their family's existence.
Right. The premise of the text's argument is that if a parent relies on the broader culture to answer the child's question of what does this mean, the culture will inevitably provide an answer that leads the child away from the historical reality of divine judgment and substitutionary atonement.
The parent is mandated to be the primary theologian in the life of the child.
Exactly. So Moses delivers this massive blueprint to the elders of Israel. He tells them about the impending slaughter, the blood on the doorposts, the perpetual memorial, and the requirement to actively catechize their children.
And the reaction of the elders is just striking. They don't form an exploratory committee to debate the merits of the plan.
No, they don't.
They don't ask Moses if there is a slightly less bloody, more aesthetically pleasing alternative to smearing animal blood on their front doors.
Their reaction highlights the profound, visceral connection between understanding deep theology and the physical response it demands.
Exodus 12.27 says, "And the people bowed low and worshipped."
And the Hebrew utilizes two highly descriptive verbs to capture this moment. First, weikod, which signifies the physical bending of the head and neck.
And second, weish t'chawu.
Right, which means to completely prostrate oneself, to fall flat on your face on the ground before a superior sovereign.
Now, let me push back on this for a second. Is this true worship, or is this just sheer terror? I mean, they were just told a lethal force is going to sweep through the land at midnight and kill every firstborn son.
That's a natural assumption.
Someone told me that, I'd probably fall on the floor too, just out of sheer panic.
It's a totally fair question, but the linguistic context and the subsequent actions point away from mere panic and toward genuine reverent worship.
How so?
Because this physical posture was triggered purely by divine revelation. They hadn't seen the final plague happen yet. They hadn't seen the waters of the Red Sea part.
Oh, right.
They simply heard the word of God, the terrifying promise of holy judgment, and the astonishing provision of sovereign grace, and their immediate, uncoerced response was to fall on their faces.
It wasn't an emotional high manufactured by a musical buildup or a charismatic speaker. It was the direct, organic fruit of understanding truth.
And that internal posture of worship immediately translated into meticulous outward action.
Verse 28 says, "Then the sons of Israel went and did so.
Yeah.
Just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did."
The Hebrew phrase kenasu translates to exact execution.
This creates a vital theological link for us. Real, saving faith always yields exact obedience.
Yes. The authors use this specific phrase to reject two opposing theological errors that have plagued religious history.
On one side, you have legalism, right? Which argues that human beings must obey a set of rules in order to earn God's favor and achieve salvation.
But the Israelites didn't earn their salvation. God graciously provided the mechanism of the blood before they did a single good work.
Right. And on the other side, you have antinomianism.
Yes, which is the belief that because we are saved by grace, the moral law and strict obedience no longer matter.
But Israel's faith in God's unmerited grace didn't lead to lawlessness. It led to meticulous, exact submission to his specific commands.
And the authors also apply this concept of exact obedience, just as Yahweh commanded, so they did, to modern ecclesiastical practices.
They critique the modern church heavily regarding how worship is conducted today. Let's impartially unpack that.
Yes. The texts argue for what is historically known as the regulative principle of worship.
The regulative principle.
According to the authors, many modern churches are saturated with human inventions, pragmatic entertainment models, theatrical spectacles, and mysticism.
They contrast that modern landscape with the exact execution of the elders in Goshen.
The argument presented by the source is that the biblical standard requires the church to worship God only in the ways he has explicitly commanded in his word.
Without adding human innovations or cultural pragmatism.
Right. The foundational idea they present is that the Creator alone has the authority to dictate how the creature approaches him.
So the Israelites execute this command perfectly. They apply the blood. They survive the night. But as massive and history-altering as this midnight was, it was ultimately just a shadow.
It was an architectural blueprint pointing forward to something infinitely greater.
We have to zoom out and look at the entire scope of redemptive history. How does the blood of a lamb in Goshen physically connect to the blood of Jesus Christ at Calvary?
The connection is made explicit throughout the New Testament. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5:7, "For Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed."
And at the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry, John the Baptist points at him and declares in John 1:29, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
The Old Testament historical event was a divine type. It was a deliberate prophetic prefiguring ordained by God to prepare humanity to understand the person and work of Jesus Christ.
The parallels between the shadow and the substance are incredible. The Passover lamb had to be an unblemished male, which prefigures the absolute sinless perfection and immaculate purity of Christ.
And the legislation in Exodus required that no bones of the Passover lamb be broken.
A highly specific detail that the Apostle John notes was miraculously fulfilled during the crucifixion, when the Roman soldiers chose not to break Jesus' legs.
But the deepest, most critical parallel is the nature of the atonement itself. This brings us to the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement.
Right. And I want us to linger on this because we often throw around the phrase, Jesus paid the price, without really grasping the mechanics of what happened.
We do.
In Egypt, the blood of a finite physical lamb absorbed the temporal judgment of God, sparing the physical life of the firstborn for a few more decades. But at the cross, the scale is cosmic.
Exactly. The math of the atonement is staggering. How does the suffering of one man over the course of a few hours on a Friday afternoon satisfy the eternal, infinite wrath of a holy God against millions of sinners?
Yeah, how does that work? Because if I owe $1 billion debt and someone hands the bank a $20 bill, the debt isn't satisfied.
It works because of the nature of the substitute. Jesus Christ is not merely a finite man. He is the infinite, eternal Son of God incarnate.
Because his worth and dignity are infinite, his suffering possesses infinite value.
Galatians 3:13 says Christ became a curse for us. On the cross, God the Father essentially gathered up the future, eternal hell of all who would believe, condensed it into a localized moment in space and time, and poured it out entirely upon his own Son.
Jesus absorbed the terrifying, unmitigated wrath of God's justice in his own body and soul. He was the ultimate substitute.
The Passover in Egypt saved a physical nation from political slavery and temporal death, but the Passover of Christ saves a spiritual people from eternal condemnation and the permanent bondage of sin.
But the material we are reviewing issues a massive warning here. And it goes all the way back to the terrified Israelite sitting in his house.
It's about the application of the blood.
Having a historical fact occur outside of your house doesn't save you. The blood sitting in a bronze basin on the doorstep in Egypt couldn't save anyone. It had to be physically applied to the doorpost.
Unapplied blood saves no one. The authors stress this heavily. Jesus Christ died on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago, but that historical fact must become a personal reality.
Like having life-saving medicine sitting on the counter. It doesn't cure you until you ingest it.
Exactly. The blood of Christ must be applied to the individual sinner's conscience through faith. You cannot rely on proximity.
You cannot rely on the fact that your parents were Christians, or that you were baptized as an infant, or that you generally try to be a decent neighbor.
No. If you are not personally hiding behind the substitute by faith, you remain entirely exposed to the unshielded judgment of God.
And we must report how the authors apply this theology polemically, because they explicitly reject several major theological viewpoints based on their exegesis of this text.
Yes, they do. First, they argue against liberal theology.
According to the source, liberal theology denies the objective reality of God's wrath entirely. The authors state that liberalism reduces the cross to a sentimental display of divine solidarity or moral example, completely stripping away the necessity of a penal blood substitution.
Furthermore, they offer a sharp critique of Arminianism. According to the text, the Arminian framework relies too heavily on humanistic self-salvation, moral effort, and the sovereign free will of man.
The authors argued that the Exodus narrative clearly demonstrates that salvation is entirely the sovereign, distinguishing work of God through a substitute. It is not a cooperative effort where man meets God halfway.
Finally, the sources reject Roman Catholic sacerdotalism.
Impartially reporting their argument here, the authors state that the Roman Catholic Mass falsely resacrifices Christ on the altar.
Right. They argue this violently contradicts the once-for-all memorial nature of the Lord's Supper, much like the Passover was a memorial of a finished historical deliverance, not a recurring magic ritual.
It is a weighty, rigorous theology. Let's try to pull all of this together. We have journeyed from the dark, tense midnight of the late Bronze Age to the eternal cosmic reality of the cross.
We've seen a holy God who executes inescapable, perfect judgment upon sin.
We've seen a sovereign, merciful God who provides the exact shelter needed to survive that judgment, the shield of substitutionary blood.
We've explored the profound mandate to remember this rescue, to refuse the amnesia of prosperity, and to actively, historically catechize the next generation around the family dinner table.
We've examined the required response of the creature, reverent worship that bends the knee in awe of revelation, and exact, meticulous obedience to the Word of God.
And most importantly, we've traced how all of these ancient shadows find their ultimate, blindingly brilliant substance in the person of Jesus Christ, the true Passover lamb.
Which leaves you, the listener, with something to really mull over as we close. We live in an exhausting culture. Every single day, the world demands that you prove your worth.
It really does.
You hustle at work to ensure you aren't passed over for a promotion. You curate your life on social media to ensure you aren't passed over for validation, for relevance, for love.
We are constantly building our resumes.
Yes, constantly trying to justify our own existence, desperately trying to prove that we are enough. But the profound paradox of the Passover is this. True peace only comes when you stop trying to prove your own worth, and instead, you hide yourself completely behind the flawless, proven worth of a substitute.
The Israelites didn't survive that midnight because their houses were the cleanest or their moral resumes were the strongest.
They survived because the blood was on the door. So as you go about your week, ask yourself, are you standing out in the open, holding up your own resume, hoping it's enough to shield you, or are you resting entirely under the blood?
That's the question.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep exploring the depths of the text, and we will see you next time.